Well, hey everybody, welcome. It's nice to see so many folks out on what is this, Monday night? Oh, it is just the beginning of the week? Oh my goodness, this is going to be a long one. It's a pleasure to see so many faces here for what we're saying is the second in an installment in a series dedicated to issues of social justice that's dedicated to the memory of Coleman Brown. Coleman is the namesake for our commons. All right, so anyway, I have some prepared remarks that I'm going to read, a little bit about Coleman to give you a sense about who he was, a little bit about his partner Irene, who is with us tonight, and then I'll give you a short introduction to Chris. All right, I need these to do that. All right, so welcome to the second installment in Brown Commons' annual Seekers, Believers, and Doubters series. And it's dedicated to issues of social and racial justice. Brown Commons was named for Coleman Brown, whom in his decades of service to Colgate University as professor in philosophy and religion, and as university chaplain, had rightfully earned the title as the ethical center of our universe. Prior to coming to Colgate, Coleman had earned a degree in history from Princeton, a master's of divinity at Union Theological and a master's of divinity at Union Theological Seminary. He had also married his high school sweetheart, Irene Catherine Mayer. The two lived in East Harlem and worked at a church in their community while Coleman studied at Union. And both were receiving an education about social injustice that would shape the work both would do for the rest of their lives. In 1963, Coleman and Irene moved to Chicago to serve an inner-city church where they were active in the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. And then in 1970, they would come to the village of Hamilton. Coleman would go on to become one of the most beloved members of the Colgate faculty, while Irene would go on to become one of the most beloved members of the Hamilton community. Irene founded the Community Action Partnership for Madison County, which is a nonprofit organization that strives to improve the well-being and safety of children and families in our community. CAP, as it is now known, has a footprint that now extends into Herkimer and Oneida counties, helping families across much of central New York. In addition to founding CAP, Irene launched the Lifelong Learning Program, which is a collaboration between Colgate and the village of Hamilton and enriches the lives of hundreds of residents each year. In recognition of her significant and lasting impact on the Hamilton and broader community, Colgate awarded Irene an honorary doctorate in 2011. We lost Coleman in 2014 after a long and courageous battle with illness, but we are thankful that Irene is able to join us tonight. So tonight we welcome back to campus one of Coleman's most devoted students, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, New York Times bestselling author, activist, and public intellectual Chris Hedges. Chris received his BA in English here at Colgate, went on to earn a Master's of Divinity from Harvard University before spending nearly 2 decades as a war correspondent. A large portion of that time, thanks, Kim. A large portion of that time was spent with the New York Times. He covered war in Central America, the Balkans, and served as the bureau chief for the Times in the Middle East. In 2002, he was part of the staff at the Times that received a Pulitzer Prize for explanatory journalism for its informed and detailed reporting before and after the September 11th attacks on the USA that profiled the global terrorism network and the threats it posed. The following year, Chris would leave the Times after being reprimanded for famously speaking out against the invasion of Iraq during a commencement address at Rockford College in Illinois. In 2002, he published the best-selling book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, launching his next career as an author, commentator, and public intellectual. Since 2006, Chris has written a weekly column for Truth Dig, and in the intervening years, he has published numerous books, including Empire of Illusion, The End of Literacy, and The Triumph of Spectacle, I Don't Believe in Atheists, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, and most recently, America, A Farewell Tour. In 2012, Chris famously sued the Obama administration over the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, as it is known, over the clause that asserted that the president has the authority to indefinitely detain individuals without habeas corpus. While a judge of the Southern District of New York initially ruled it unconstitutional, the Obama administration won on appeal and the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear the case. After Coleman's passing in 2014, Chris wrote an article dedicated to Coleman, which was simply titled, My Teacher. In the article, Chris states, "Education is not only about knowledge, it's about inspiration. It is about the belief that what we do in life matters. It is about moral choice. It is about taking nothing for granted. It is about challenging assumptions and suppositions. It is about truth and justice." In addition to his activism, Chris teaches college courses to prisoners as part of the New Jersey Scholarship and Transformative Education in Prisons Consortium. Through his work, Chris tackles some of the most divisive issues of our time while remaining committed to these principles of truth and justice, which also guided a lifetime of work for Coleman and Irene. So tonight, Chris joins us to speak about the central theme of a book he published over 10 years ago and relied on the editorial skills of his teacher, Coleman Brown. So please join me in welcoming Chris Hedges back to Colgate.
Thank you. When I finished my book, American Fascists, the Christian Right, and the War on America, Coleman Brown, my great mentor at Colgate, who generously edited the book, arranged for a seminar with members of the Philosophy and Religion Department. My book met with a frosty reception by these professors, most of whom I knew, and several of whom I had studied with. As we walked out of the meeting, Coleman said to me, "The problem is they don't believe in heretics." I believe then and believe now that the greatest moral failing of the liberal Christian church was its refusal, made in the name of tolerance and dialogue, to denounce the followers of the Christian right as heretics. By tolerating the intolerant, it ceded religious legitimacy to an array of con artists, charlatans, and demagogues and their cultish supporters. It stood by as the core message of the Christian gospel, concern for the poor and the oppressed, was perverted into a magical world where God and Jesus showered believers with material wealth and power. The white race, especially in the United States, became God's chosen agent. Imperialism and war became divine instruments for purging the world of infidels and barbarians, evil itself. Capitalism, because God blessed the righteous with wealth and power and condemned the immoral to poverty and suffering, became shorn of its inherent cruelty and exploitation. Rational and scientific inquiry, because it conflicts with the movement's mythology, and warped religious ideology and conspiracy theories, is attacked and rejected. The condemnations of Muslims as satanic, of Christians who do not subscribe to the prosperity gospel as nominal Christians, of non-believers as damned, of those in our criminal caste, mostly poor people of color, as morally depraved and deserving of harsh sentences, including the death penalty, and the branding of the GBLT community as sick. Deny whole peoples their dignity and their legitimate right to be. These assaults are personal. I was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. I spent 7 years in the region. My friends, fellow journalists, and colleagues, most of whom were Muslims, were not one-dimensional caricatures devoid of humanity, intelligence, and moral probity. In fact, in my 20 years overseas, I saw how men and women of great integrity arose in all cultures and all religions to fight the oppressor on behalf of the oppressed. I saw the profound anguish and despair visited on those whose sexual orientation did not conform to the rigid heterosexuality celebrated by the Christian right. My closest friend in boarding school, a gentle, kind, and sensitive boy, as he approached adolescence, struggled with his sexual identity. He was from Texas. His family were fervent evangelicals. Condemning himself and being implicitly condemned by his church and his family, he committed suicide as a teenager. The American Journal of Preventive Medicine last year reported that lesbian and gay youth who said that religion was important to them were 38% more likely to have recent suicidal thoughts compared to lesbian and gay youth who reported religion was less important. Religiosity among lesbians alone was linked to a 52% increased chance of recent suicidal ideation. Finally, because I teach in the college program through Rutgers University in the New Jersey prison system, and the author Matt Taibbi is filling in for me tonight, I am acutely aware that our monstrous system of mass incarceration, we hold 25% of the world's prison population, although we are 5% of the world's population, is primarily about social control, not criminal justice. Half of the 2.3 million people in our prisons have never been charged with physically harming another person. 94% were coerced to plea out and denied a jury trial. These prisoners, almost all poor people of color, live trapped in deindustrialized urban wastelands, what Malcolm X called our internal colonies, where they were abandoned by the corporate state. Their bodies are worth nothing to the corporate state on the streets, but once locked in a cage, they generate $60,000 a year to prison administrators and guards, privatized money transfer companies, medical companies, phone companies, and commissaries. Mass incarceration, the most important civil rights issue of our time, is a multi-billion-dollar-a-year industry. People say the system does not work. They are wrong. It works exactly as it was designed to work. I spent 2 years researching the Christian right. I traveled across the country, spending time in megachurches, creationist seminars, right-to-life retreats, and even took a course taught by D. James Kennedy in Florida called Evangelism Explosion. I conducted a few hundred interviews, and I met many evangelicals of goodwill and good intentions. But I came away believing that the leadership of the Christian right cruelly manipulates the despair of its followers and poses a danger to our open society. Dr. James Luther Adams, my ethics professor at Harvard Divinity School, told us that when we were his age, he was then close to 80, we would all be fighting the Christian fascists. The warning, given to me more than 3 decades ago, came in a moment Pat Robertson and other radio and tele-evangelists began speaking about a new political religion that would direct its efforts at taking control of all institutions, including mainstream denominations, and finally the government. Its stated goal was to use the United States to create a global Christian empire. It was hard at the time to take such fantastic rhetoric seriously, especially given the buffoonish quality of those who expounded it. But Adams warned us against the blindness caused by intellectual snobbery. The fascists, he said, were not going to return with swastikas and brown shirts. Their ideological heirs would wrap fascism in the Christian cross and the American flag and hold mass recitations of the Pledge of Allegiance. Adams was not a man to use the word fascist lightly. He was in Germany in 1935 and 1936 and worked with the underground anti-Nazi church known as the Confessing Church, led by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Adams was eventually detained, interrogated by the Gestapo, and expelled from Germany. He left on a night train with framed portraits of Adolf Hitler placed over the contents inside his suitcase to hide the rolls of home movie film he took of the so-called German Christian Church, which was pro-Nazi, and the few individuals who defied them, including the theologians Karl Barth and Albert Schweitzer. The ruse worked when the border police lifted the top of the suitcases, saw the portraits of the Führer, and closed them up again. I watched hours of the grainy black and white films as he narrated in his apartment in Cambridge. Adams saw in the Christian right, long before we did, disturbing similarities with the German Christian Church, similarities that he said would, in the event of prolonged social instability accompanied by economic decline, see American fascists, under the guise of religion, rise to dismantle the open society. He despaired of liberals who, he said, as in Nazi Germany, mouthed platitudes about dialogue and inclusiveness that made them ineffectual and impotent. Liberals, he said, did not understand the power and allure of evil, nor the cold reality of how the world worked. Like Bonhoeffer, he did not believe that those who would fight effectively in coming times of turmoil, a fight that for him was a fundamental part of the biblical call, would come from the church or the liberal, secular elite. Adams told us to watch closely what the Christian right did to ethnic and religious minorities, as well as those who did not adhere to rigid sexual stereotypes. He watched the Nazis use moral, quote-unquote, values to launch state repression of opponents. Hitler, days after he took power in 1933, imposed a ban on all homosexual and lesbian organizations. He ordered raids on places where homosexuals gathered, culminating with the ransacking of the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin. Thousands of volumes from the Institute's library were tossed into a bonfire. The assault was cheered by the German churches. Adams said that the GBLTQ community, Muslims, immigrants, and poor people of color would be the first deviants singled out by the Christian right, but we would be the next. I remember thinking his warning was perhaps too apocalyptic. But nearly 4 decades later, the power brokers in the Christian right have moved from the fringes of society to the floor of the House of Representatives and the Senate, the White House, the judiciary, and major government departments. FRC Action, the legislative affiliate of the Family Research Council, gave 245 members of Congress a perfect 100% for votes that support the agenda of the Christian right. The Family Research Council, which called on its followers to pray for God to vanquish the demonic, that's their quotes, forces behind Trump's impeachment, is identified by the Southern Poverty Law Center as a hate group because of its campaigns to discriminate against the LGBTQ community. Trump has elevated members of the Christian right to prominent positions of power, including Mike Pence to the vice presidency, Mike Pompeo as Secretary of State, Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education, Ben Carson as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, William Barr as Attorney General, Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, and the televangelist Paula White, who promises her donors their own personal angel, to his Faith and Opportunities Initiative. Frank Amadea, the Trump campaign's liaison for Christian policy, claims to have raised an ant from the dead. And the Christian right, which makes up as much as a quarter of the country, or close to 80 million people, has its own version of the brown shirts, the 4 hire mercenary armies and private contractors amassed by people such as Eric Prince, the brother of Betsy DeVos. Reason, science, facts, and verifiable truth are useless weapons against this belief system. I think the Christian right is best understood as what anthropologists will call a crisis cult. Crisis cults arise in most collapsing societies. They promise through magic to recover the lost grandeur of a mythologized past. This magical thinking banishes doubt, anxiety, and feelings of disempowerment. Traditional social hierarchies and rules, including white male supremacy, will be restored. Those blamed for our decline, intellectuals, artists, liberals, immigrants, undocumented workers, poor people of color, feminists, will be disempowered. America, freed from the contamination of these quote-unquote degenerate forces, will be restored. The Christian right propagates its magical thinking through a selective biblical literalism. They hold up as sacrosanct biblical passages that buttress their ideology and ignore or grossly misinterpret the ones that do not. They live in a binary universe. They see themselves as eternal victims, oppressed by dark and sinister groups seeking their annihilation. They alone know the will of God. They alone can fulfill God's will. They seek total cultural and political domination. The secular reality-based world, one where Satan, miracles, divine edicts, angels, and magics do not exist, destroyed their lives and their communities. This secular world took away their jobs and their futures. It destroyed the social bonds that gave them purpose, dignity, and hope. In their despair, they often succumbed to alcoholism, drug, gambling, and pornography addictions. They endured familial breakdowns, divorce, jail, evictions, unemployment, and domestic and sexual abuse. And then from the depths of suicidal despair, they suddenly discovered that God has a plan for them. God will save them. God will intervene in their lives to promote and protect them. God has called them to carry out His holy mission in the world and to be rich, powerful, and happy. The only thing that saved them was their conversion, the realization that God had a plan for them and would protect them. These believers were pushed by the wreckage caused by neoliberalism into the arms of charlatans. All who attempt to reach them through the rational language of fact and evidence are hated and ultimately feared, for they seek to force believers back into what they call the culture of death that nearly destroyed them. Trump has handed veto and appointment power over key positions in government, especially in the federal courts, to the Christian right. He has installed 133 district court judges out of 677 total, 50 appeals court judges out of 179 total, and 2 U.S. Supreme Court justices out of 9. Almost all of these justices were vetted by the Federalist Society and the Christian right. Many have been rated as unqualified by the American Bar Association, the country's largest nonpartisan coalition of lawyers. Trump has moved to ban Muslim immigrants. He has rolled back civil rights legislation. He has made war on reproductive rights by restricting abortion and defunding Planned Parenthood. Trump was the first president to address the radical anti-choice March for Life event in person. He permits discrimination against LGBTQ community people in the name of quote-unquote religious liberty. He has ripped down the firewall between church and state by revoking the Johnson Amendment, which prohibits churches which are tax exempt from endorsing political candidates. His appointees routinely use biblical strictures to justify an array of policy decisions, including environmental deregulation, endless war against Muslims in the Middle East, tax cuts, and the replacement of public schools with charter schools, an action that permits the transfer of federal education funds to private, quote-unquote, Christian schools. The iconography and language and symbols of American nationalism are intertwined with the iconography, language, and symbols of the Christian faith. Mega-pastors who often share Trump's narcissism rule despotic, cult-like fiefdoms. They make millions of dollars by using this heretical belief system to prey on the despair and desperation of their congregations. They distort the Bible to champion unfettered capitalism, the cult of masculinity, the belief that violence can purge the world of evil, white supremacy, bigotry, American chauvinism, religious intolerance, anger, racism, and conspiracy theories. Those within the evangelical movement, such as the editors of the magazine Christianity Today, who have attempted to state the obvious about Trump, that he is corrupt, inept, and immoral, and should be removed from office, are brutally attacked. Nearly 200 evangelical leaders, including former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee, former Representative Michelle Bachmann, Jerry Falwell Jr., and Ralph Reed, signed a joint letter denouncing the Christian Today editorial. Evangelical Christians who criticize Trump are as swiftly disappeared as Republican politicians who criticize Trump. Trump received 80% of the white evangelical vote in the 2016 presidential election, and in a poll during the House impeachment proceedings, 90% of evangelicals said they opposed the impeachment and ouster of the president. Among Republicans who identify as white evangelical Protestants, that number rises to 99%. Trump is routinely compared by leaders of the Christian right to the biblical king Cyrus, who rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem and restored the Jews to the city. Trump, of course, has no ideology, but his ideological vacuum is being swiftly filled by the Christian right. This Christianized fascism, with its network of megachurches, schools, universities, and law schools, and its vast radio and television empire, is a potent ally for the beleaguered president. The Christian right has been organizing and preparing to take power for decades. If the nation suffers another economic collapse, which is probably inevitable given the return of casino capitalism on Wall Street, another catastrophic domestic terrorist attack, or another war, Trump's ability to force the Christian right's agenda on the public and shut down dissent will be dramatically enhanced. It is important to note that modern evangelicals, like modern fundamentalists, bear little resemblance to evangelicals and fundamentalists of a few decades ago. Traditional evangelicals and fundamentalists believe that they should distance and remove themselves from the contaminants of secular society, including politics. But a change took place in the early 1970s with the rise of what we call the Reconstructionist or Dominionist movement, articulated by Rousas Rushdoony, the intellectual godfather of the modern Christian right. His 1,600-page, 3-volume work, Institutes of Biblical Law, which makes for very turgid reading, argued that American society should be governed according to the biblical precepts in the Ten Commandments. He wrote that the elect, like Adam and Noah, were given dominion over the earth and must subdue the earth along with all non-believers so the Messiah could return. Reconstructionism or dominionism was a radically new interpretation within the evangelical movement. The Messiah, it was traditionally taught, would return in an event called the rapture, where there would be wars and chaos. The non-believers would be tormented and killed. The elect would be lifted to heaven. The rapture, which is not in the Bible, was not something that could be manipulated or influenced, although believers often interpreted catastrophes and wars as portents of the imminent second coming. Rushdoony, however, promoted an ideology that advocated violence and the seizure of power to create the Christian state. His ideology was in many ways the mirror image of liberation theology, which came into vogue at about the same time. While the liberation theologians crammed the Bible into the box of Marxism, Rushdoony crammed it into the equally distorting box of fascism. I saw this ideological clash as a reporter in the 1980s in Central America. In El Salvador, leftist priests endorsed and in a few cases traveled with the armed rebel movements in Nicaragua and El Salvador. At the same time, the Christian right, led by figures such as Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell, along with conservative Latin American pastors and clerics, backed genocidal dictators such as Rios Montt in Guatemala or Augusto Pinochet in Chile. They supported the Contras, fighting the Sandinistas in Nicaragua and the brutal military regime in Argentina, which disappeared 30,000 of its own citizens. The Institutes of Biblical Law calls for a society that is harsh, unforgiving, and violent. Offenses such as adultery, witchcraft, blasphemy, and homosexuality merit the death penalty. The death penalty will be expanded to include, quote-unquote, moral crimes, including apostasy, blasphemy, sodomy, and witchcraft, as well as abortion, which will be treated as murder. Women will be subordinate to men. Those who practice other faiths will become, at best, second-class citizens and eventually outcasts. The wars in the Middle East will be defined as religious crusades against Muslims. There will be no separation of church and state. The attack on quote-unquote failing government schools by Trump in his State of the Union address, when calling for the expansion of school choice vouchers, are words lifted verbatim from the Christian right and Rushdoony. The only legitimate voices will be Christian. America will become an agent of God. Those who defy the Christian authorities will be branded as agents of Satan. The world is to be subdued and ruled by a Christian United States. Rushdoony, a virulent anti-Semite, dismissed the number of 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust as an inflated figure. His theories on race echo Nazi eugenics. The white man has behind him centuries of Christian culture, and the discipline and selective breeding this faith requires, he wrote, the Negro is a product of a racially different past, and his hereditary has been governed by radically different considerations. The background of Negro culture is African and magic, and the purposes of the magic are control and power over God, man, nature, and society. Voodoo, or magic, was the religion and life of American Negroes. Voodoo songs underlie jazz, and old voodoo, with its power goal, has been merely replaced with revolutionary voodoo, a modernized power drive. Rushdoony was also deeply antagonistic to the federal government. And let me just interject here. I don't know if you've been following the news today, but Clarence Thomas's wife, Virginia, who comes out of this movement, and if you look on the Clarence Thomas's website, he cites Rushdoony as his major intellectual, has just been put in charge of Trump's purge of the government. Rushdoony was deeply antagonistic to the federal government. He believed the federal government should concern itself with little more than national defense. Education and social welfare should be handed over to the churches. Biblical law must replace the secular code. The poor, condemned for sloth, indolence, and sinfulness, would be denied government assistance. Crimes requiring the death penalty would be expanded. Reconstructionism remains at the heart of this movement. It is being enacted through school vouchers with federal dollars going into Christian schools, and the assault against federal agencies that deal with poverty, education, and human services. The Christian state would come about not, Rushdoony argued, through signs and wonders, but through the establishment of the Christian nation. Rushdoony's son-in-law, Gary North, a popular writer and founder of the Institute for Christian Economics, laid out the aims of the Christian right. So let's be blunt about it. We must use the doctrine of religious liberty to gain independence for Christian schools until we train up a generation of people who know that there is no religious neutrality, no neutral law, no neutral education, and no neutral civil government. Then they will get busy in constructing Bible-based social, political, and religious order which finally denies the religious liberty of the enemies of God. The Christian right finds its ideological justification in a very narrow segment of the gospel. In particular, the letters of the Apostle Paul, especially the story of Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus in the book of Acts. It draws heavily from the book of Revelations and the Gospel of John, which is Gnostic. These books share an apocalyptic theology. The book of Revelations is the only time in the Gospels where Jesus sanctions violence, offering up a vision of Christ as the head of a great and murderous army of heavenly avengers. Martin Luther found the God portrayed in Revelation so distasteful, he put the book in the appendix of his German translation of the Bible. These books rarely speak about Christ's message of love, forgiveness, compassion, and concern for the poor and oppressed. They focus on the doom and destruction that will befall unbelievers and the urgent need for personal salvation. The world is divided between good and evil, between those who act as agents of God and those who act as agents of Satan. The Jesus of the other three Gospels, the Jesus who turned the other cheek and embraced his enemies, an idea that was radical and startling in the ancient Roman world, is purged in the narrative selected by the Christian right. The cult of masculinity is celebrated. Feminism and homosexuality are social forces, believers are told, that have rendered the American male physically and spiritually weak. Jesus is portrayed as a man of action, casting out demons, battling the Antichrist, attacking hypocrites, and castigating the corrupt. The cult of masculinity brings with it the glorification of strength, violence, and vengeance. It turns Christ into a Rambo-like figure. Indeed, depictions of Jesus within the movement often show a powerfully built man wielding a sword. The image of Christ as warrior is appealing to many within the movement. The loss of manufacturing jobs, lack of affordable health care, negligible opportunities for education, poor job security has left tens of millions of Americans embittered and locked out. This ideology is attractive because it offers them the hope of power, protection, and revenge. It sanctifies their rage. It stokes the paranoia about the outside world maintained through bizarre conspiracy theories, many on display in Pat Robertson's book, The New World Order, and certainly on display in the Trump White House. Deindustrialization and the betrayal of the working class by the ruling elites, including the Democratic Party, has been crucial to the success of the movement. And by the end of the 2 years I spent reporting for the book, I was convinced that only by reintegrating the working class into society through stable, well-paying jobs, access to good education, health care as a human right, only then could the Christian right be effectively blunted. These believers are correct in blaming the ruling elites for abandoning them, and they are correct in condemning a callous and immoral culture. The problem is that their solution will snuff out our open society. The depictions of violence that will befall non-believers are detailed, gruesome, and brutal. It speaks to the rage many believers harbor and the thirst for revenge. This in large part accounts for the huge sales of the apocalyptic series by Tim LaHaye and Jerry B. Jenkins. And let me interject that if you took the top 10 books, best-selling books in the country in the New York Times, they would all be Christian books, and the only reason they're not is because the New York Times has decided that's a category they won't count. In their novel, Glorious Appearing, based on LaHaye's interpretation of biblical prophecies about the second coming, Christ eviscerates the flesh of millions of non-believers with the mere sound of his voice. There are long descriptions of horror, how the very words of the Lord had superheated their blood, causing it to burst through their veins and skin. This is a quote from the book. Eyes disintegrate, tongues melt, flesh dissolves. The novel, part of the Left Behind series, are the best-selling adult novels in the country. And they preach holy war. Natural disasters, terrorist attacks, instability in Israel, the fighting in Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Afghanistan are all signposts. The march towards global war, even nuclear war, is not to be feared, but welcomed as the harbinger of the second coming. And leading the avenging armies is an angry, violent Messiah who dooms millions of non-believers to a horrible and painful death. The movement seeks to discredit the rational disciplines that are the pillars of the Enlightenment, to abolish the liberal polity of the Enlightenment. This corruption of science and law, a central objective of the Trump administration, is vital in promoting the doctrine. Creationism or intelligent design, like eugenics for the Nazis, must be introduced into the mainstream as a valid scientific discipline to destroy the discipline of science itself. This is why the Christian right is working to bring test cases to ensure that school textbooks include intelligent design and condemn gay marriage. This assault on science is especially deadly, given the climate emergency, which if not addressed in a meaningful way very soon, will mean the extinction of the human species along with most other species. The inclusion of crackpot theories in scientific or legal debate is part of the effort to destroy dispassionate and honest intellectual inquiry. Facts that get in the way of the myth or the ideology are altered. Lies in this worldview become true. Hannah Arendt called this process nihilistic relativism, although a better phrase might be collective insanity. The Christian right has fought successfully to have creationist books sold in national park bookstores in the Grand Canyon, taught as a theory in public schools in states such as Alabama and Arkansas. Intelligent design is promoted in Christian textbooks. All animal species, or at least their progenitors, students read fit on Noah's Ark. I went to the Creationist Museum in Peterborough, Kentucky. And the first scene that replica of a scene that we were ushered into was the Garden of Eden with a waterfall and plastic figures of Adam and Eve, naked, but Eve was turned so you couldn't see her breasts. And there was a T-Rex with a saddle on it, because as the guide explained, in the Garden of Eden, the animals, everybody lived together, and she said, well, I'm sure you all wonder why the T-Rex has such big teeth. It's because Adam and Eve used the T-Rex to open the coconuts. And then we went into the next room, which was a replica of Noah's Ark, and she said, I'm sure you all wonder how Noah got the dinosaurs on the ark. Well, he only put baby dinosaurs on the ark. And it's funny here, but when you're sitting with 40 or 50 people who believe it, it's totally terrifying. Tens of millions of Americans are hermetically sealed within this bizarre worldview. They are fed a steady diet of conspiracy theories and lies on the internet, in their megachurches, in Christian schools and colleges, and on Christian television and radio. Elizabeth Dilling, who wrote The Red Network, very popular book among the Christian right, she's a Nazi sympathizer, is required reading. Thomas Jefferson, who favored separation of church and state, is ignored. This Christian propaganda hails the quote-unquote significant contributions of the Confederacy. Senator Joe McCarthy, who led the anti-communist witch hunts in the 1950s, all are rehabilitated. He's rehabilitated as an American hero. The Israel-Palestine conflict, along with the wars in the Middle East, are defined as part of the worldwide battle against satanic Islamic terror. Those who embrace this movement need to feel, even if they are not, that they are victims surrounded by dark and sinister forces bent on their destruction. They need to elevate themselves to the role of holy warriors, infused with a noble calling and purpose. They need to sanctify the rage and hypermasculinity that are the core of fascism. The rigidity and simplicity of their belief, which includes being anointed for a special purpose in life by God, are potent weapons in the fight against their own demons and desire for meaning. What convinces masses are not facts, Hannah Arendt wrote, and not even invented facts, but only the consistency of the system which they are presumably part. Repetition, somewhat overrated in importance because of the common belief in the masses' inferior capacity to grasp and remember, is important because it convinces them of consistency in time. Trump's disdain for facts and truth, his penchant for magical thinking, along with his embrace of conspiracy theories mesh seamlessly with the worldview of the Christian right. Trump, like the Christian right, sees himself as under attack from the media, academia, the liberal establishment, Hollywood, and the Democratic Party. In this worldview, global warming is a hoax, Barack Obama is a Muslim, millions of people voted illegally in the 2016 election. Trump and his brain trust, including figures like Stephen Miller, are Manichaeans. They view the world in black and white, good and evil, them and us. On the surface, it appears incongruous that the Christian right would rally behind a narcissistic New York real estate developer who has been repeatedly charged with sexual assault, is a serial philanderer and adulterer, lies like he breathes, is consumed by greed, does not appear to read or even know the Bible, routinely defrauds and cheats his investors and contractors, expresses a grotesque misogyny and contempt for women, and yearns for despotism. But in fact, these are the very characteristics that define most of the leaders of the Christian right. Trump preyed on desperate people through the thousands of slot machines in his casinos, his sham university, and his real estate deals, just as megachurch pastors prey on their followers by extracting seed offerings, love gifts, tithes, and donations, and by selling miracle healings along with prayer cloths, self-help books, audio and video recordings, and even, if you're Pat Robertson, protein shakes. Pastors have established within their megachurches, as Trump did in his businesses, despotic fiefdoms. They cannot be challenged or questioned any more than an omnipotent Trump can be challenged on the reality television show The Apprentice, which created his fictional persona that vaulted him to the presidency. They seek to replicate their little tyrannies on a national scale. The personal piety of most of the ministers or pastors who lead the Christian right is a facade. Their private lives are usually marked by Trump-like hedonistic squalor that includes mansions, private jets, limousines, retinues of bodyguards, personal assistants and servants, shopping sprees, lavish vacations, and sexual escapades. And because they run churches, church funds pay for their tax-free empires, including their lavish lifestyles. They engage in the same kind of nepotism found in the Trump White House, elevating family members to prominent or highly paid positions and passing on their ministries to their children. The Christian right's scandals, which give a glimpse into the sordid lives of these multi-millionaire pastors, are legion. Jim and Tammy Faye Baker's Praise the Lord Club, for example, raked in as much as $1 million a week before Jim Baker went to prison for nearly 5 years. He was convicted of fraud and other charges because of a $158 million scheme in which followers paid for vacations that never materialized. As the Baker empire came apart, there were also accusations of drug use and rape. Tammy Faye died in 2007, And now Jim Baker is back, peddling survival food for the end days and telling his significantly reduced television audience that anyone who opposes Trump is the Antichrist. Paul and Jan Crouch, who gave the Bakers their start, founded Trinity Broadcasting, the world's largest televangelist network, now run by their son Matt and his wife Lori. I spent hours watching them as part of a live studio audience. Viewers were encouraged to call prayer counselors at the toll-free number shown at the bottom of the screen, and then it was a short step from talking with a prayer counselor to making a love gift and becoming a partner in Trinity Broadcasting, and then sending in more money during one of the frequent praise-a-thons. The Crouches reveled in the tasteless kitsch, as does Trump. They sat during their very popular nightly program in front of stained glass windows that overlooked Louis XVI-inspired sets awash in gold rococo and red velvet, glittering chandeliers, and a gold-painted piano. The network emblem, which Paul Crouch wore in the pocket of his blue double-breasted blazer, featured a crown, a lion, a horse, a white dove, a cross, and the Latin phrases along with other elements. The Crouches, of course, would have been at home in Trump Tower, where the president also has a faux Trump crest, allegedly plagiarized, and has decorated his penthouse as if it was Versailles. The Crouches exhorted viewers to send in checks for $1,000, even if they could not afford it. Write the check anyway, Paul Crouch said. He died in 2013. He tells his viewers that it's a step of faith, and the Lord will repay them many times over. Do you think God would have any trouble getting $1,000 extra to you somehow, he asked during one of these praise-a-thons. Viewers, many of whom struggle with deep despair and believe in these miracles and magic, that it's the miracle and magic alone that hold them back from the abyss, often found it impossible to resist this pressure. Trinity Broadcasting Network remains home to several of the worst charlatans in the Christian right, including Benny Hinn, who says that Adam was a superhero who could fly to the moon, and claims that one day the dead will be raised by watching Trinity Broadcasting Network, his show, from inside their coffins. Hinn claims his quote-unquote anointings have cured cancer, AIDS, deafness, blindness, and numerous other ailments and physical injuries. Now, those who have not been cured, he says, did not send in enough money. These religious hucksters are some of the most accomplished con artists in the United States, a trait, of course, they share with the current occupant of the Oval Office. I spent several hours at the end of the 2 years of reporting with two of the country's foremost scholars on fascism, Fritz Stern, himself a refugee from Nazi Germany, and Robert Paxton at Columbia University. I wanted to know if the ideology of the Christian right fit the parameters of classical fascism. Was it virulent enough and organized enough to seize power? Would it go to the ruthless extremes of previous fascist movements to persecute and silence dissent? Has our deindustrialized society replicated the crippling despair, alienation, and rage that always feeds fascist movements? This magical belief system, as it was for impoverished German workers who flocked to the Nazi Party, is an emotional life raft. It is all that supports them. And I believe the only way to blunt this movement is to reintegrate these people into the economy, to give them economic stability through good wages and benefits, to restore their self-esteem and the social bonds that knit them to the wider community. They need to live in a society that is not predatory, but instead provides well-funded public schools, free university education, universal health care, a society in which they and their families, and most importantly their children, can prosper. Let us not stand at the open gates of the city, waiting passively for the barbarians. They are coming. They are slouching towards Bethlehem. Let us shake off our complacency and cynicism. Let us openly defy the liberal establishment which will not save us, to demand and fight for economic reparations for the poor and the working class. Let us give all Americans a reality-based hope for their future. Time is running out. If we do not act, American fascists clutching Christian crosses, waving American flags, orchestrating mass recitations of the Pledge of Allegiance, united behind a ludicrous figure such as Donald Trump, will ride this rage to power. Thank you.
All right, so we're going to open it up to questions now. And if you would, wait till you get a microphone.
Thank you. I was wondering if you think that there are other countries who are experiencing a rise in the Christian right, and in addition to that, if you think that there are other religions that are being warped in a similar way that Christianity is.
Well, that's a good question, because I went to a Right to Life weekend in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. You know, it was really, I like reporting because it always challenges your assumptions, and it was only when I sat through that weekend that I understood what the Right to Life movement was about, which has nothing to do with reproductive rights or abortion. So it was about 400 women, and when I got there, in the front row, there were Catholic priests from a group called Priests for Life. There were Baptists. There were an array of in some formal denomination that you wouldn't have seen before. So it does cross religious boundaries. And just for that weekend, because it was a chilling and fascinating period, they brought the women in and they asked the post-abortive sisters to stand. So almost all the 400 women stood. And then what they do is they give them a doll. And they tell them that that is the child they murdered. And they have to name the doll and bathe the doll and dress the doll and sleep with the doll for these retreat weekends. And then at the end, offer up, hold that doll and beg for forgiveness and promise to fight the culture of death, which is us. And for me, that was a classic example of how they were preying on and manipulating the shame and despair that these women felt. And so it's cross denominations. It's a very, the evangelical movement. I mean, Bolsonaro comes out of it in Brazil. These all have a political agenda, and it's been used quite effectively against, especially in Latin America, the Catholic Church, which at least under Vatican II had some kind of social conscience. But yes, it's certainly extended far beyond the border. TBN is huge. I mean, it's worldwide. I lived in the Middle East, and they were broadcasting out of Lebanon.
Who or what organizations are giving you hope at this point in time?
Extinction Rebellion. And do you know what Extinction Rebellion is? Extinction Rebellion is based in London. It's a radical, nonviolent organization centered around the climate emergency. They on several periods have shut down London, hundreds of arrests, shut down London Bridge. I was part of the Extinction Rebellion. We shut down the streets in front of the New York Stock Exchange last fall. Roger Hallam, the co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, is coming to the United States on March 2nd. So that I was very involved in Occupy, the Occupy movement, and But I think that, I think anybody, we've had 40 years of the elites, who have been well aware of the science around the climate, have done nothing. And we have no time left. Between the wildfires in Australia and California, and it's frightening. We don't have any snow in Princeton this year. It's scary. So I think that nonviolent, sustained acts of civil disobedience is where I find my hope. I was at Standing Rock, and that's a group that I have a lot of time for. Yeah.
I'm not hearing any politicians in your list.
No, as Emma Goldman said, if voting was that effective, it would be illegal. I certainly, will vote for Bernie Sanders, but let's be clear. No, if Bernie doesn't get a majority, which it doesn't look like he will, all the superdelegates will kick in on the second round. You watched, the quote-unquote liberal network MSNBC has been amazing since the Nevada caucus in terms of demonizing Sanders. So I find it unlikely that the Democratic Party, Lloyd Blankfein, one of the major figures, paid Hillary Clinton $675,000 to give 3 talks, which can only be described as a bribe, just came out and said he would vote, between Sanders and Trump, he would vote for Trump. And the New York Times has actually ran several stories talking about how the Democratic donor class will hold their nose and vote for Trump. Rather than, have anybody roll back against the tax boycott. Bank of America banning taxes, Amazon didn't ban any taxes and got a rebate. This is just crazy. And even if Bernie got elected, he'd be utterly paralyzed in Washington. So I think the history of any society, including our own, shows that social change is propelled by movements. Union Zinn did a great job of doing this in the people's history in the United States. So it's not that I don't vote, but I don't put a lot of hope in it. I also don't think the Democratic Party at this point functions as a real party. The base, which clearly wants Sanders, is in conflict with the hierarchy of the party, which unfortunately has the tools to deny Sanders the nomination, just as they did in 2006. They've got all sorts of dirty methods. They don't allow independents to vote in the primaries, although taxpayers pay for the primaries. That cuts out a lot of his youth base because they're not registered Democrats. 2016, they clearly stole the Nevada caucus. They disenfranchise voters. So, go vote. But unless we build organizations there's a great story. You look back at the 60s, I was a kid, but my father was involved in the anti-war and the civil rights movement, so he dragged me along to this stuff. And there was a wonderful, I think it was 70 or 71, huge anti-war demonstration surround the White House. Nixon put empty city buses all around the White House as barricades. This is in Kissinger's memoirs, but don't go buy the book. And he and Nixon are at the window, and Nixon's wringing his hands going, "Henry, they're going to break through the barricades and get us." And that's exactly where we want people in power to be. That's our job, to put them there.
So in my class, we've learned about the concept of symbiotic extremism, how 2 poles of genocidal rhetoric feed off of one another and have a mutually beneficial relationship where one needs the other to exist. In the case of the war on terror, those 2 poles are opposite spectrums of terrorism, the Christian right and ISIS. Because of this concept of symbiotic extremism, the Christian right has been described before as the American Taliban. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah. And that's a very good point, because I covered the war in the former Yugoslavia. And what you point out, I watched in practice. So I wrote a book called War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, which is about the culture of war. I spent 20 years mostly covering war. And in there is a story about a Croatian police chief. I think his name was Kir. So he was the police chief in a fairly large city, and you had the radical Croat, Ustasha, is the old fascist, Croatia was allied with Nazi Germany, and they were called the Ustasha, and they used all the Ustasha symbols and everything. And then you had the radical Serbs. And they were seeking, as you point out, conflict. And so Keir was going between the two groups trying to diffuse the conflicts, and he was assassinated. He was Croatian. He was assassinated by the Croats. And what I saw in conflict after conflict was that those radical extremists, first and foremost, got rid of those figures within their own group who didn't embrace the extremism. And throughout the war in Yugoslavia, you had very cynical alliances between these extremist groups. So I'm not going to give you a history of the war, but there was a city called Banja Luka. It had a large Croatian population. Franjo Tuđman, the president of Croatia, wanted an ethnically pure state. He had ethnically cleansed most of the Serbs. He wanted that Croat population in Banja Luka, and so he cut a deal with Slobodan Milosevic, the president of Serbia, to ethnically cleanse the Croats and push them into Croatia. So yes, that's a very good point. They need each other in the same way that the Taliban need. And you know, if you're in the Middle East, we don't hear within, you know, if you read the New York Times and listen to NPR, you're not going to hear what these radical Christians are saying. But if you're in the Middle East, their comments about Muslims are given very wide play. And it serves the interests of the Muslim extremists. You're right. You're exactly right. It's a very important point. And so what happens as civil societies break down is that center is eviscerated and destroyed. Yes, very good point.
With the way that Trump has disregarded governmental, what's the word I'm looking for? Unspoken rules of governmental policy making, I've heard fears that Trump could actually refuse to follow the results of the election should they not go his way. Is this a genuine fear that you could, I guess, that you would fear? And if it is, what could we do about it?
I think that I found the whole impeachment proceedings quite frightening. Now, I'm not going to let the Democrats off the hook because there were constitutional violations that were carried out under the Democratic administration. I mean, the decision to interpret the 2002 Authorization to Use Military Force Act as giving the executive branch the right to assassinate American citizens. I'm talking about the assassination of Anwar al-Awlaki, the radical cleric in Yemen. 2 weeks later, his 16-year-old son, the misuse of signing the statements, wholesale surveillance, which is violating the Fourth Amendment. These are all constitutional violations that the Democrats took part in. And what they actually picked out, I think, to use to go after Trump were the more trivial violations, not the more systemic and substantial ones. Nevertheless, Trump was, I think, pretty strong case that he was guilty of obstruction of justice and the misuse of his office, and the Republican Party, and there must be, I mean, they can't all be stupid. I mean, there must be people in the Republican Party who are well aware that Trump is shredding the rule of law, and they unfortunately were too cowed and worried about their own political careers to do anything about it. So that's a very frightening moment because, number one, it normalizes these constitutional violations, including the fact that we are the most spied on, monitored, watched, photographed population in human history, and I covered the Stasi state in East Germany. But so it normalizes all of those, and Trump has now essentially been, he realized he's untouchable. He can do anything he wants. So he's already talked about, serving more than 2 terms. I don't put much past him. I think I think it's a legitimate concern.
If the Christian right maintains its hold on power, what do you predict could happen to America as we know it today?
Well, despotism never, very rarely is, I think historically, it does not arise overnight. And if you go back and look at the rise of the fascists in Germany between 1933 and 1938 and 39, there was significant opposition in the courts, in the press, in the artistic communities. Dachau was really, at the beginning, set up for communists and intellectuals and journalists and all the cabaret owners who were making fun of the Nazis. And so and that's what frightens me, that you have a kind of creeping despotism, and that's what we have. And because Trump has no real, what was the latest approval ratings for Trump is what, 49%? Is that right? I think, right? Yeah. This is just terrifying. And so he's clearly catering to this segment, which is utterly devoted to him. And we know what they want to do. I know. I spent a lot of time in listening to it. I was there. And how far they can go, that's an unknown. But we know where they're going. They want to make abortion murder. They hate the press. The reality-based press, the press that still speaks out of verifiable fact. There's certainly assaults against education. Betsy DeVos calls charter schools a way to bring about the kingdom. That's a quote. So I think a lot of it depends on us. And unfortunately, we're being steamrolled.
What can we, as college students who are often labeled as, radical and unqualified, what can we do to kind of fight against the far-right Christian groups?
Well, as I said, when I wrote my book, my first chapter is called Despair. And I don't think that you can read I'm writing about the members of the Christian right, the followers of the Christian right. And I don't think you can read those stories and not be pretty heartbroken at what's happened to them. The severe dislocations and very real pain that envelops their lives. And I do think that Aristotle laid it out, 2,500 years ago. If you have, he would call it aristocratic, by the way, Aristotle would consider that we live in an oligarchy because we don't have direct democracy. But if you see the rise of aristocratic power and massive income inequality, then, as Aristotle said, you have two choices, and that's revolution or tyranny. And I think that the extreme now, this is the worst income inequality, worse than the Gilded Age. You have three men, Bezos, Buffett, and Gates, who control more wealth than the bottom 50% of the country. I don't have the figures at the tip. I don't even what 15 million children go to bed hungry. This is just nuts. And I think the only hope of breaking the back of this movement, because it's impervious to rational discourse. And the reason it's impervious to rational discourse is because they're terrified of being thrust back into that reality-based world that caused them such pain. And I think that it's our responsibility to begin to rebuild the policies of the New Deal. Let's be clear about Sanders. He's a democratic socialist. He'd be part of the mainstream in Germany and France. He's not radical. He's not calling for worker-owned businesses or the nationalization of the banks, the fossil fuel industry, and the arms industry, all of which I personally think is a good idea. He's not calling for any of that. He's not really even taking on the grotesque amount of expenditures that we spend on the military, 25 times more than, I don't know, the rest of the world or something. So, but I think that when you distort your society, I saw it in Yugoslavia, when you distort your society like this, you inevitably create movements like this. So I was in Montgomery visiting Brian Stevenson, and Brian and I were walking through the streets of Montgomery. There's somebody you should give an honorary doctorate to. And Brian and I are walking through Montgomery, and he's pointing out all the Confederate memorials, which just litter, and Montgomery, 50% of Montgomery's black. And then Brian said they all went up in the last 10 years. And I said, that's exactly like Yugoslavia. Suddenly, people retreated into this mythological past of, the field of blackbirds and Serbs or Croats or whatever, because that was the last kind of readout they had to find meaning and identity. And that's what's happened with the Christian right. So I really think that it's a matter of battling back against the oligarchic class that has created the social decay that has given rise to this movement. We're not going to argue them out of creationism. I mean, just as an aside, I was always totally upfront about who I was and where I came from. I did my real name. When I did the D. James Kennedy course, I was sweating through the entire course that someone would Google me. But I also told them that I grew up in the church. My father was a minister, that I went to Harvard Divinity School. And it was fascinating that none of them wanted to talk about the Bible with me. None. Because they don't know the Bible. They know what they're fed, but they don't know the Bible.
Hey, maybe one last.
Yeah, sorry. Your mention of, I'm over here, sorry. Your mention of Brian Stevenson, made me think of this. Obviously, the movie Just Mercy was based off his life and his work. Who is a graduate of an evangelical Christian college. And raised in a conservative evangelical denomination. And the illustrations and the examples you gave and the people you gave, do you think that a majority came from what I would say maybe baby boomer generation, Christian right? As you get to meet other people like Brian Stevenson, even a few weeks ago we had Opal Tometi on campus, one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, grew up in an evangelical Christian church in Phoenix, Arizona. You talk a lot about mega churches. You had Adam Hamilton, the largest mega church in the Methodist Church, is leading the movement to ordain gay pastors and to perform same-sex marriages. Millennials, from what I understand, from what I've seen, did not vote at the same percentage as older Christian right people. Much like Biden told us a few years ago, younger generations, they just didn't show up at the polls. So as I see, you mentioned Tammy Faye Baker's, Jim Baker back in ministry, yet her son at the same time identifies as a LGBTQ plus supportive and started a church in New York City. As you see the younger generations of, as you call the Christian right coming forward, do you have hope in that regard that there is actually a different voice rising up, especially within the evangelical church, and it's coming from the younger generations as opposed to the baby boomer generations, which are certainly in power at this time? Not really, because those people are, like the Christianity today, the baker's kid has been completely ostracized by the movement, and you'll always find anomalies within the movement, or people who have the courage to step out and call for gender equality. They're there, but they're shunted aside, and I think that's because at its core, look at Liberty University, Patrick Henry University. These are, I look at them as political movements fundamentally, and they're fundamentally about achieving political power. And they've been quite good about organizing in a way that we on the left have not. So Patrick Henry University, starting with the Reagan administration, was pumping these ideologues into government. So yes, you're right that there are figures. And I think we also have to remember that the real purges, like for instance in the Southern Baptist denomination, didn't happen until 1980, when they took over Southern Baptist Seminary, which was one of the great seminaries in the United States. You can go back and read about it. There was a huge purge. And the Southern Baptists I always found very interesting because while they weren't particularly good on gay rights or
but they were politically left. They were pro-union, and so all of these denominations have been under assault. I mean, I come out of the Presbyterian Church, and a lot of these denominations have split, where you have had sizable evangelical constituencies essentially pull away from. The Lutherans have had it, and then those of us who come out of the old liberal mainstream are, fading away. The numbers are fading away, diminishing. So.
Can I just ask one follow-up question to that? The rapid decline of the church in the last 30 years. It's interesting. I didn't even make the connection until you said it was about 30 years ago that the right got involved in politics. Now there's this rapid decline. Even the Pew Research in the fall said the rapid decline is just unbelievable. Do you think that is connected, that people are just disengaging because it's become more political?
You're talking about the liberal church?
Both. The rapid decline, both in liberalism, the liberal church, and I guess the Christian right.
I mean, that's a longer lecture. But I would say I would trace a lot of it back to white flight out of urban areas. I would trace it to the kind of boutique activism that the church became involved with, essentially not only forgetting about the primacy of social justice, but the primacy of economic justice. An aging church population that, despite whatever the rhetoric was, that really didn't want anybody disrupting their social club. And then a society that essentially atomized itself by no longer joining groups, whether that was the church or Rotary or whatever. I mean, a Grange when I was a kid in Maine. The church became victim of that atomization as people retreated into essentially spending all day in front of screens. But it was a combination of factors, and then it's compounded because what happens, and I saw this at the New York Times, when institutions start to wither or become more anemic, they become more and more cautious because they become more frightened. So the Times is, as a journalistic organization, is more frightened because it can't afford to drive away advertisers, and I think that's also been true within the church.
All right, I'm going to cut it off at that. Thank you all. Thanks to all the students, especially for asking questions. Let's thank Chris one more time for joining us tonight.